Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest this afternoon, Elinor Langer, who will be delivering the inaugural lecture in the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Endowed Symposium at UCSB for 2003-2004. Today she'll be talking about her just-released book, 100 Little Hitlers, The Death of a Black Man, The Trial of a White Racist, and the Rise of the Neo-Nazi Movement in America, which was recently published by Metropolitan Books. Courtesy of the UCSB bookstore, there will be opportunity to purchase and have the book signed after her talk. An award-winning journalist, Langer has written for the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, The Nation, among other publications. She's also the author of the critically acclaimed biography, Josephine Herbst, which was first released in 1984. Herbst became an important figure, a literary figure, in the 1930s as a result of articles that she did for the New Masses, Partisan Review, as well as some proletarian fiction which she had written, particularly a trilogy that began with the novel Pity Is Not Enough. However, like most radical women writers of this era, she had largely been omitted from the pioneering studies of the literary left. Then the posthumous discovery of a packet of letters made it possible for her to become the subject of Langer's extraordinary biography. 100 Little Hitlers, Langer's latest book, is the outgrowth of a special report on the American neo-Nazi movement today that she prepared for The Nation in 1990. The result of more than a decade of meticulous research on the Nazi-aligned skinhead movement in Portland and the culture that it created it, 100 Little Hitlers was selected as a finalist for the J. Anthony Lucas Prize for Work in Progress. Langer delves into the long-standing radical groups with which the skinheads were associated, and she starts tracking the progress of such powerful figures as white Aryan resistance leader Tom Metzger, through the stations of the right, from the Birch Society to the Christian Identity to David Duke's Klan. And in the process, Langer offers an alternative perspective on the efforts by civil rights lawyer Morris Dees, who spoke here in this series, to prove Metzger responsible for the Portland killing. Despite her political sympathies, Langer refuses to turn the story she recounts into a simple morality tale, opting instead for a fierce intellectual honesty that yields no easy explanations for the rise of the neo-Nazi movement in America. Instead, as one reviewer notes, the murder at its center is a reflection not just of racism in the United States, but of something much more widespread. Langer has taken one act of violence, looked at it carefully and courageously, and illuminated an entire moral universe. Please join me in welcoming Elinor Langer.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm truly honored to have been invited to appear here today under these very distinguished auspices and before this, I have to remember not to move, before this very distinguished audience to talk with you about my new book, 100 Little Hitlers. At the same time, I'm very much aware that one of the reasons I am here, a reason reaching well beyond my own labors on the book and beyond all the work that Holt, the publisher, put into it, is something beyond all of that, is the 1995 bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. I think that California shares to some degree with the Northwest the realization that beginning in the 1980s, a Nazi-inspired racist movement that had existed largely out of sight for many years began to come to the surface and attract a larger following. But for most of the rest of the country, the realization that something underground, was rising up, something was out there, came later. I doubt very much whether even as recently as a decade ago, the events and the implications of my book would have received the attention that they are getting today. Today, I'm hoping to be able to do three things. One is briefly introduce you to the book as a whole. Two is read a couple of passages, short passages. And three, open the floor to questions and, I hope, discussion. Briefly, 100 Little Hitlers grew out of an event that people in Portland, and indeed in the Northwest, remember as well as I do, the killing of an Ethiopian man named Mulugeta Sarah by 3 Portland skinheads who were members of a neo-Nazi gang called Eastside White Pride in November 1988. My own interest grew out of two kinds of closeness to the skinheads I turned out to have. One was geographical. The killing took place not very far from where I live, but even closer to where I lived when I first came to Portland, within a few blocks of that neighborhood. And second, what turned out to be my personal closeness to the 3 skinheads involved in the killing, by which I don't mean that I knew them, but my degrees of separation from them were not nearly what I would have expected from who they were and who I was. The first, one of them lived in my neighborhood a few blocks away in a building that I had recently considered taking an office in. One of them was the homecoming king of a local major public high school and the son of a prominent liberal civic activist in Portland whose good works, community activities, overlapped a fair amount with the good works of people that I knew. And the third, the actual killer, Ken Miskey, was a rock musician who went by the name of Ken Death, stage name Ken Death, who was part of a bohemian artistic underculture in Portland that included a lot of writers and artists and filmmakers, the most prominent of whom was the one whose name you probably know is Gus Van Sant, who was then just starting out as a young filmmaker, young independent filmmaker in Portland, and other people who I knew then and knew now. And that was very surprising to, of course, to find that they were as close at hand as they really were. I mean, many of those experiences or those relationships were true of other people in Portland, because Portland is really a small community. But unlike other people who were making those discoveries, I was a writer. I had a long-standing interest in political trials, and I also had a long-standing editorial relationship with The Nation, which made it possible for me to arrange very easily to cover the skinhead trial for The Nation, which was all I originally intended to do. In January 1989, I began going to the preliminary hearings. To make a very long story short, it turned out that the trial that I was going to cover never took place. You want this lower? That would be great. I'm just reaching. Is that okay? Okay. More? Thank you. It wants to go up. There, okay, I got it, okay. What first happened was that the trials were severed, the cases were severed from one another, meaning that there would be no joint trial. And then the cases were individually plea bargained, meaning that there was not going to be any trial at all. The reasons for the plea bargains are fundamental to what later unfolded and fundamental to the existence of my book, and I want to try to explain them a bit now. Some of what follows may be a little convoluted, but I will get back to the thread in due course. The most important reason for the plea bargains was the understanding on the part of the district attorney that the killing of Mulugeta Seraw had not taken place the way the public believed it had taken place. The killing was represented from the beginning as practically a lynching. It was represented as a hunting party of skinheads armed with bats out to get a black man. The killing, in fact, grew out of an accidental confrontation of two cars at 1:30 in the morning, a Sunday morning, after a Saturday night in which the people in both cars had been drinking. One car had three Ethiopian men in it. The other car had three skinhead men and three skinhead girls. The Ethiopians were parked in the middle of the street because the curb sides were all full. They were parked in the middle of the street, dropping Mulugeta Seraw off at his apartment when the skinhead car came head-to-head with it, couldn't get by. Words were exchanged. The racial element entered. People realized that some of them were black and some of them were white. A fight, they got out of their cars, a fight erupted, and very sadly, the last two people to enter the fight were Mulugeta Seraw, who ran down. He had gotten out of his car previously so the other cars could pass, but he ran down to where the fight was happening. And then Ken Miskey was literally the last person to get out of the car, grabbing a bat that he found on the floor of the car that he happened to be riding in, another unplanned occurrence. And Miskey took the bat and he brought it down on the side of Mulugeta Seraw's head, interrupting where he was fighting with another skinhead. Seraw fell to the ground. Miskey continued to hit him. One of the other skinheads came over and joined in, kicking him in the gut and in the head, and the skinheads ran away, and very shortly, Mulugeta Seraw was dead. So, a horrible, brutal fight, but not an intentional one. I'm not going to take the time to explain all the reasons why it solidified into the image of the fight that it did. But it happened instantly. Just very briefly, the first interviews with the Ethiopian survivors said that they had been attacked unprovoked with bats. That was the lead the police followed up. And more important, that image of the skinheads doing something that nobody else in town would dream of doing was vital to what people in Portland wanted to believe about the crime. And to understand that, you have to go back to the unique racial history of Oregon. That's why I said this was going to get convoluted. Oregon is literally the only state that was admitted to the Union with a clause in its Constitution that not only excluded slavery, it excluded black people. 3 other states, Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois, also excluded black people, but only Oregon had that in its Constitution at the time it was admitted. That was not repealed until 1926. And in fact, the exclusion of black people from Oregon began even earlier with an 1843 organic law of the territory, which provided that should black people come into the territory, they would be beaten a certain number of times, at 39, every 6 months, whipped until they got the idea and left. And in fact, it began even earlier with prohibitions on the emigration of blacks from the wagon trains in Iowa. Something called the Oregon Emigration Society of Iowa prohibited black people. So needless to say, with this kind of climate, the black population of Oregon remained minuscule, something that changed only in World War II, when black people came to work in the shipyards, after which a great many of them left, was still small again in the period after World War II. And it was only in the 60s and a little bit after that the few blacks that there were began to mobilize themselves, to be a force at all in political life, which now is pretty much the case. Very sensitive period. 1988, the year Mulugeta Serra was killed, Portland was, I believe, 88% white. It was known as the whitest big city in the United States. It's dropped a little bit in the next census, in the 2000 census. So this death occurred at a time of a rising black movement, a time of a lot of opposition, or first manifesting of opposition to police violence against the black community, and a time when Oregonians had more or less decided to forget about this racial history. It was a time when it could have come out usefully, but it didn't. And instead, the skinheads became a really convenient focus for Oregon racism. So no one cared about the misrepresentation of the killing. And the problem of the misrepresentation of the killing became worse 2 years later, when Tom Metzger went on trial, was brought to trial by the Southern Poverty Law Center for the killing, because now not only were there these skinheads who don't have anything to do with us, there's an outside person, a Californian, on whom we can blame this killing. So we don't have to look at any of our own racial history. So all this was behind the plea bargain. It is a long way about, but it's why the plea bargain was welcomed in the white community, though not, I have to say, in the black community, and not by the Ethiopians. Those people would greatly have preferred a trial which would have illuminated many things about the background culture that didn't come out. Instead, there was a demonization of the skinheads right from the start, which I can testify to personally, as I was in these courtrooms. It was really impossible to say this grew out of a street fight. The lawyers couldn't say it, the press couldn't say it, nobody could say it. It was unheard of. There was a picture of Ken Miskey in the Oregonian, picture of all the defendants eating peanuts at the defense table one day, and the caption said, defendants Miskey and whoever sitting at the table eating salted peanuts, and the implication really was Satan is behind them. Satan is pouring the salt. No one but a demon would be eating peanuts when they were on trial for killing Mulugeta Serra. So besides all the local reasons for the plea bargains, the Federal Justice Department was in the act. The skinhead movement was surfacing in a number of places around the country. The Justice Department was under pressure to seem to be doing something about it, and one of the things they chose to do something about was to work on getting a strong result in this Portland case. So there was that pressure. And thirdly, the Southern Poverty Law Center was behind the scenes trying to facilitate a plea bargain, actually. By the time these plea bargains took place, and by the time it was clear there was no trial, I had already learned a great deal about the skinhead movement, both in Portland and somewhat nationally, because of the smallness of the community, for a number of other reasons. People were willing to talk. Nobody really was talking to them. So I began to get a pretty strong sense of the widespread and grassroots nature of the skinhead movement in the city, and particularly realized how dominant the skinhead culture had been in the city in the years between 1985 and 1988. It's important to realize that there were a number of violent skinhead crimes in that period. There was a lot of graffiti, synagogue trashing. the Portland, a neo-Nazi skinhead movement was very visible between those years. And it was only with Seurat's death that a stop came to it, that people began to sit up and notice it. So when the trial was canceled, to get back to the thread of my book, I didn't give up the story. I continued with the investigations of the local skinhead movement, and it became the special issue of The Nation that Leonard Wallach just referred to. Special issue of The Nation published in July 1990, called The American Neo-Nazi Movement Today. In the fall of 1990, the Southern Poverty Law Center brought its case against Tom Metzger. And I just want to remind you here, if you don't know anything about the case, that Tom Metzger chose to represent himself in this trial. And much of the critique that I have of the trial, I think would not be necessary had he had a lawyer. I think there was it was a very unbalanced situation because of the self-representation, but so it's important to remember that. In any case, the trial was modeled after a famous Klan case that the Southern Poverty Law Center had just concluded the year before, that some of you may remember, the Donald case in Mobile. A black man named Michael Donald in Mobile, young man, had actually been lynched. He'd gone out to get a pack of cigarettes, and 3 Klansmen who were members of a local Klan organization who were in turn part of an Alabama Klan organization, had decided in advance to lynch a black man that night in response to a jury decision they didn't like in a case of a white policeman having been killed in Mobile. And they went out and lynched him, and they hung him from a tree, and the killing was practically signed KKK. There were very, very few questions about it after a while. I mean, initially it wasn't even tried as a Klan case criminally, but eventually it was. And Dees had the idea of establishing liability not just of the individuals, but of the Klan organization. And he successfully did that, and you probably remember the awarding of the Klan headquarters in Tuscaloosa to Beulah May Donald, the mother of Michael Donald. A very successful case, and as far as I have ever been able to fathom, a legitimate case, a case in which the agency argument that they used, that the Klansmen who killed the man were acting as representatives of the organization, was legitimate, an appropriate case. I should say also there is no transcript of the Donald trial, so that everything you have ever read about it comes from the memories, I guess, of people who were there, including any reportorial pieces. But nonetheless, it seems a good model of a case. That was the case that they tried to bring against Tom Metzger in Portland. They said that a young skinhead who had come to Portland, a guy by the name of Dave Mazzella, who had been a follower of Tom Metzger's, had been in Portland 5 weeks at the time of the killing, had caused the death of Mulugeta Surratt by whipping up these members of East Side White Pride. Things which seemed questionable to me, even at the time, on 2 grounds. One is Metzger's organization was not really an organization. War was a movement. White Aryan resistance was a movement, nothing with a corporate structure. It was a newspaper. It was an answering machine. It was part of a flux nationwide. And secondly, I already knew that the Portland skinheads did not have the relationship to Dave Mazzella was important for the Southern Poverty Law Center's case because I had talked to them so much earlier. They'd said, you know, who is this creep that came from California? He'd gotten out of there pretty quickly. He was not somebody who was acknowledged by the skinheads as their leaders. So the trial was put on, very dramatic, very tense, very, very intense trial, and it was the story of an outside agitator. It was the story of someone coming up from California to corrupt our innocent Oregon children who never would have killed Mulugeta Serra. This racial crime would never have occurred had not this bad guy come. Very unlike what I saw, which was the sort of slow emergence of a grassroots movement in which the skinheads had educated themselves. They had on their own reached out toward Nazism. They had discovered it on their own. And that's what I had been learning. So I was disturbed, fascinated but disturbed by the Metzger trial. And this disjunction between what I saw as the real and natural history of the skinhead movement and the way it was presented in the trial eventually, you know, many years later, became the structure of this book. Part one of the book is history. It includes several parts. It has the day of the killing, which really reconstructs the life and times of the skinheads, this kind of sociological reconstruction. It describes the evolution of the Portland youth underground in the 1980s, a period when the skinheads dominated the youth music scene in a very violent fashion. It's a history of the larger neo-Nazi movement that Tom Metzger is a part of, going back to its roots, name you may remember, Rockwell, George Lincoln Rockwell, and others. And it includes the real history of an organization called the White Student Union Aryan Youth Movement, which was founded in Sacramento in the 70s by a guy by the name of Greg Withrow. And actually, that's where the title of the book comes from. This first sort of Nazi youth organization in the United States, they called it their 100 Little Hitlers program. They sent out startup kits to interested people all over the country. And that's where it came from. The second part of the book, Law, is the history of racism in Oregon, the story of the criminal proceedings and the sort of the incremental way they led to the Metzger trial, the rise and the agenda of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the trial itself. I should say, I left one important thing out, and that is the gist of the plea bargains was a racial motivation plea. Paradoxically, the skinheads did not want to plead guilty to racial motivation because they said it was an accident. They hadn't meant to kill him, and they would have killed him if he were white. Both those things. The importance of the racial motivation plea, of course, is that it's what allowed the civil suit to be mounted. Had there been no racial motive, there couldn't have been anyone responsible for it. So it was that chain that I was trying to get at before. In any case, I wish that in a meeting such as this, I could give you balanced reading. I could say, okay, this is history, this is law. These are the two parts of the book. But the book wasn't written that way. It wasn't, the law part of the book wasn't written to prove the history part of the book wrong. The scenes in both parts are constructed in the same way, which is by bringing to bear everything that I could find with a great deal of documentary evidence as well as personal interviews, to everything I could find that would show what the real motives were of the people, you know, acting in a particular way at a particular time, scene by scene. And sort of to let the facts speak for themselves about how they match, you know, whether they do or whether they don't go together. So I can't say, you know, history, law, but I am going to read two sections from the history part, brief sections, and then I'm going to come back at the very end to an observation about the law part of the book. Excuse me for 1 second here. The first part I'm going to read is an introduction to what I've been referring to as the domination of the Portland youth scene in the late 1980s by this skinhead movement. And it's an introduction to a much longer treatment. If this, I think I better do this, okay. Sealed into the sidewalk of a fashionable Northwest Portland neighborhood, directly across the street from a fine French restaurant, is a graffito from about 1984 signaling a new presence in the youth scene, PUSH for Portland United Skinheads. The PUSH graffito is the single most public marker we have that the Portland youth underworld that spawned East Side White Pride was not simply the product of a theatrical imagination, a street cabaret staged by the city fathers along with the summertime Shakespeare in the Park, but a living community of flesh and blood people, other people's children, invisible to most of the citizens of Portland most of the time, but known to one another very well. To explore the history of this secret community is not a simple matter, since the materials for its reconstruction are so thin. Such traces of it as remain owe their existence largely to police investigations, and the police are not in the business of creating systematic archives. They are solving crimes. Since neither for the scene itself nor for the individuals who were part of it are the available sources thorough and deep enough to tell us all we should wish to know, it would be tempting to skip the effort of reconstruction altogether and proceed immediately to judgment, as many do, but that would be a mistake. For elusive as it is, the evolution of the Portland youth scene in the 1980s contains an important story. The story of the end of the World War II era, with its widespread refusal of Nazism, and the start of a new era. The transition begins with graffiti. In the word PUSH itself, the S is still soft and round, but above it is an SWP for Supreme White Pride, in which the S resembles the backward Z of the SS lightning bolts. In another SWP nearby, the Z is more rectangular, a partial swastika, and a whole swastika appears in the sidewalk just beyond. In pushes elsewhere in the city, the swastika-like Z is the norm. 5 years after the first swastikas, and a few months after the death of Mulugeta Serra, I was standing in line with some friends at the Pine Street Theater, that's a rock venue, when there emerged from the parking lot a platoon of 10 Nazi skinheads. Black-jacketed, black-booted, with shining heads and faces, they stood by in formation, a strange contrast with the disheveled punks also waiting in line, as their leader conferred with the club bouncer who held his ground firmly, no entry. I do not know who those particular skinheads were, nor does it matter to this story. What I do know is how frightening they were, and all the more so because they were young and drunk. Their leader was a round-faced, rosy-cheeked, all-American teenager who looked as if he had just stepped out of a Hitler Youth recruiting poster. The followers looked all too eager to be led. Standing only a few feet away from them in a loose crowd, I felt my sense of myself as a particular individual with a particular history seep away into something that I can only describe as a universal vulnerability, a fear that I would arbitrarily be singled out. What if, rebuffed by the bouncer, the little stormtrooper would cast about for a way to retrieve his wounded honor and, scanning the crowd, alight on me, shouting out the words shouted by the skinheads' girlfriends in this very parking lot the night Serra was killed, "So, you're a Jew." It could have happened. It often has happened. And what would have happened next? And if this fear affected me, a middle-aged woman with some experience in holding on to a sense of self under shifting circumstances, how much more must it have affected the young punk rockers, flotsam to begin with, who, caught in what might well have become a standoff between the 10 of them and the 100 or so of us, seemed to be doing exactly what I was, staring out past the drunken skinheads across the space between us, hoping not to be noticed. The ability of a small group to control the behavior of a larger one can be described by only one word: power. In the years that followed the first graffiti, starting around 1985, the Portland skinheads had it. The next selection is about one such skinhead. It's about Kenneth Miskey, the killer, and it too is only part of a longer introduction to Miskey. And this particular section is descriptive and does not go into his background, but just so you know, he did have about the worst infancy and childhood I personally had ever heard of, beginning with being physically abused when he was 10 days old and never being in a stable household until much later in life, when it was obviously too late. The home to which Kenneth Miskey returned when the night was done, that is the night he killed Mulugeta Serra, was a low-ceilinged, pine-veneered finished room he shared with Julie Bellick in the basement of her mother and stepfather's rented house in a blue-collar neighborhood in southeast Portland, not too far from the fatal corner. In another part of the basement, separated by a curtain, lived Julie's younger brother with his skateboards and bottle caps. But in Ken and Julie's section, the decor was all their own, and they had assembled it together. Posters from the local shows of assorted bands, ranging from The Accused, on which a weird mohawk sprouting character someplace between a cannibal and an Amazon holds a dripping dagger in one hand and a skull in the other, to Portland's own Poison Idea, on which a muscular skinhead with large teeth and a menacing grimace holds another dripping dagger against the neck of a gay male victim who will be lucky to lose his beard rather than his head, slide into an undifferentiated collection of anti-black and anti-Semitic posters, leaflets, and flyers that nearly covers one wall. Some, like the drawing of a microwave, Jew dwarfs, "There is an oven in your future," or the official run-in nigger target, are more or less standard issue in Ken and Julie circles and are easy enough to come by, but others reflect an individual search. There are a number of newspaper clippings about Rudolf Hess, a picture evidently Xeroxed from a history book of Hitler and Mussolini reviewing troops, another textbook photo labeled "Communists Rounded Up and Held at Bay by Stormtroopers, 1933, to which Ken has added the note, "Poor little Jew boys lining up to die," and a Xeroxed photo of the crammed Jewish cemetery in Prague with the caption, "Huddled in death as in life, Jews from Prague's Old Town ghetto rest in the old Jewish cemetery," which I suspect, with its stones leaning crookedly this way and that, and its information that in some places the graves are a dozen bodies deep, must have tickled their sense of the macabre as well as their senses of humor. Elsewhere around the room, the theme continues. Their videos are Leni Riefenstahl's celebration of the 1934 Nazi Party rally at Nuremberg, Triumph of the Will, a number of recent TV talk shows featuring the White Aryan Resistance's camera-ready skinhead contingent, including Dave Mazzella, some segments of Race and Reason, a white point-of-view television show made for cable access by Tom Metzger. Their records, apart from such American classics as the album of the Dead Kennedys, whose jacket features the dead Jack Kennedy, and an album called Dayglow Abortions, featuring Nancy and Ronald Reagan feasting on a fetus, are mainly British skinhead music, White Rider by Screwdriver, Oi Oi music by The Oppressed, Face the Aggression by The Condemned 84. On a coffee table by the bed, at least on the day of the police photographs, are some well-thumbed books about each of their favorite Nazis. Mengele, his, and Speer, hers. More Speer, along with William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich as a kind of primer, sits on the shelf. There is a swastika made of gum wrappers. A sheaf of gory posters for Ken's own band, Machine, the lyrics to a work in progress, Senseless Violence, and the well-framed group photographs of East Side White Pride taken by Julie herself in a place of honor on the wall confirm that Ken and Julie are not outsiders to this world, like children plastering their bedrooms with posters of stars they will never meet. They are members of it, they are in it, it is their world. Ken Miske was practically a legend. Of the waves of street kids and semi-street kids who made up the Portland underground music scene in the 1980s, some had identities and some did not yet and never would have identities, no matter how many safety pins or earrings they wore or wear or what they did with their hair. And it was plain to everyone who met him as soon as they met him that Ken was one of the ones who did. He had arrived in Portland from Seattle in 1981 at 16, been taken up by an older acquaintance, Jim Cartland, and when Cartland joined with Mark Wells to form the booking company Cartwell Shows 2 years later, Ken came along with the territory, a link between the two promoters and their younger audiences. Stage crew, bouncer, discoverer of the hardest, farthest out, cutting-edge rock bands that he found in Seattle and elsewhere and persuaded Cartland and Wells to bring to Portland, he was visible to everyone in the rock scene, known by the stage name Ken Death, for his love of the loud, fast, violent, not for the squeamish death metal music that drove away all but the most violent listeners. With Machine, his reputation was becoming solidified, and there had been a previous band, Sudden Infant Death, but it was not so much either as stage crew or as musician that Ken Miske stood out. It was by force of personality, energy, for there was an aura about him, a presence, that made people who knew him feel he might have what it takes to be a star. Loud, funny, wild, and reckless, pound for pound, there was more of him somehow than of most of the people in town. Filmmaker Gus Van Sant, then part of the loose Portland underculture I was talking about before, even starred him in a film personifying street life on the occasion of his release from prison on a burglary charge in 1987. A 2-minute rumination on women in prison written by Van Sant and spoken by Ken from the middle of a highway. It was called Ken Death Gets Out of Jail. The year between the fall of 1987, when he got out of jail for the burglary, and the fall of 1988, when he went back in for killing Mulugeta Sarah, was probably the happiest year of Ken Miske's life. He had Machine, which was developing a new sound and which in the novelty-driven, ever-evolving world of American rock music might possibly, just possibly, have been going somewhere. He had East Side White Pride, a haven for the racist theories and feelings unspeakable elsewhere he had sharpened in prison, as well as a band of brothers he could trust on the streets. And he had Julie. Julie and Kenny were a natural match. They had met in 1984 when she was 12 and he was 19 at a smoky, drug-filled apartment known as Homicide House for the ambiance favored by their mutual friend Trey Tanis, also known as Trey Bundy, after Ted, to whom it belonged. And when they met again in the same place after Ken got out of jail, they knew they wanted to be together. Not only did they have a common history, they were dropouts, they drank, they sniffed, swallowed, or injected any drug in sight. They had a common vision, for Julie's racism was independent of Ken's. She had come to it on her own through study and investigation during the time he was pursuing it in prison. And unlike many of the girls who hung around East Side White Pride, she was not only a follower, but a comrade. She could easily have been in power, that stands for preservation of the white American race. The girl-dominated skinhead crew started about then, But both in her own right and through Ken, she was accorded a status in East Side white pride granted to no other girl, and she liked being associated with the boys. Delicate, feminine, with a kind of sharp, fine-boned beauty that with a change of dress could have placed her on the arm of an executive or on the page, in the pages of Vogue. She was strong, bold, and scrappy as well. Sometimes she even carried a gun, and if necessary, in a street fight, she could get out there with the best of them and do her part. Life in the cluttered little apartment was not quite all swastikas and music. A photo album now part of the policed files includes some unusual items, such as portraits of some of their friends' penises and a shot of another friend shoving a large dildo between the legs of a small skeleton. But there are a lot of ordinary snapshots as well. Friends, grandparents, an East Side White Pride basketball game, a visit of Ken and Julie's to the zoo. Their letters, too, written during various separations, have a certain conventionality of the "I love you, do you love me? I have to go to the store, bye for now, hi, I'm back, I'm going to sleep, good night, zzz, here I am again" variety that seems to lurk in the heart of every American teenager. But there are also real intimacies in there, fantasies and confessions of the kind exchanged only by true lovers in the night. Like other couples, Ken and Julie had their problems. He strayed, she clung. They fought, sometimes violently, over things as trivial and later embarrassing as whose turn it was for the Nintendo. But their love supported their politics, and their politics supported their love. Among the photos detached from the album at some point for use as evidence are a number of pictures of Ken giving the Nazi salute, once even in a hot tub, partly clowning, as he often did, but partly not. Interspersed in the letters are the salutation from him to "My dear Julie, my white patriot forever," or from her, a reference to the Reverend Richard Butler of the neo-Nazi Aryan Nations compound in Idaho, whom she invokes almost as an arbiter in one of their fights. It was the future as well as the present that held them together. Once Ken told me that one of the things that interested him about Hitler was how he had been a nobody, a transient, like a bum on the streets of Portland, and how he had risen up out of that nothingness to rule the world. And I understood for a moment how that might well attract them, for they were all bums on the streets of Portland. Ken, Julie, their friends, and without a vision, they had nowhere to go but down. Julie was even studying German. Ken and Julie planned to have a family and to be married in that order, and they were beginning to put their vision into practice. November 13th, 1988 was their anniversary. They had a cat, Heinrich, after Himmler. They wanted a dog who would have been called Rudolph after Hess. And when Julie was pregnant with the baby they both wanted but later lost, they decided to call him Joseph after Mengele. They had no plans for the contingency that the baby might have been a girl, but Eva is the name that comes to mind. I said that I'm not able to balance this kind of presentation with the legal history that's the second part of the book. But I don't want to close without a comment about it. I know that some reviewers and some readers disagree with the critique, feeling that when a person like Tom Metzger, who's had such a long-running, baleful, stirring up role in the racist movement in the United States, feeling that someone like that is so baleful, is so sinister, that no matter that you get him by whatever means you can. This is leaving aside the question of whether he was gotten or not, which is a different matter entirely. There's a quotation from Morris Dees in my book that seems to be the point on which in which people divide. Morris Dees was assisted in the trial of Tom Metzger by a Portland attorney named Eldon Rosenthal, who at one point, this is according to Eldon Rosenthal, turned to Morris and said, you know, remember I said he represented himself. Eldon said, "This isn't fair, we're beating him all over the place." And according to Eldon, and a remark he's repeated several times, Morris turned back to him and said, "He wouldn't be fair to you in an alley. Why should we be fair to him in court?" And a number of the reviews of my book have paused on that point, with people dividing. You know, I am on one side of it, and other people are on the other, and it's certainly worth airing. It's certainly worth talking about. But my own thinking has a great deal to do with you know, what my own understanding of the sources of American political freedom are, and my awareness that this was a private case brought by you know, a wealthy organization against someone they didn't like, that didn't really have the means to defend himself. In this case, we have a good liberal integrationist bringing a case against the bad racist. But in the present climate, where let's say conservative forces are acquiring more wealth and more legal foundations and more the means and the knowledge, the skills, the precedents even to do the same kind of thing in reverse, it doesn't really take much imagination to see that the tables could easily be turned. So I thought I would close today by reading a comment from the ACLU representative in the case. The ACLU, in my view, did not play an adequate role in this case at all. They declined to represent Metzger, although they have occasionally represented him before in Southern California cases, always, you know, to great controversy, of course. But they did enter an amicus brief, which somewhat narrowed the grounds on which the case eventually went to the jury, but they did not pursue they did not pursue these issues on appeal. Nonetheless, the ACLU attorney, in a very brief discussion of the constitutional implications of the case, said this. He said, "Your Honor, if I may recount to the court what happened in the 16th century with Sir Thomas More when he was discussing with his clerk the role of law. The clerk asked Sir Thomas More whether or not it would be permissible to ignore the law in order to accomplish a good result. Sir Thomas More asked the clerk to consider the law as the trees in a forest, and he said to that clerk, 'Would you be willing to chop down those trees in your efforts to apprehend the devil?' The clerk said that he would be willing to chop down every single tree in that forest to apprehend the devil. And Sir Thomas More replied, 'And when you finally came upon the devil and the devil turned upon you, behind which tree would you hide?'" Thank you.